Hey everyone, welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Library. I'm Dama Tamanawala, Garrett McGillivray, and today we're joined by Michael Emory, president and founder of Allied. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
We'll get right into it. Allied has been around for over 30 years. Can you talk about the founding of the company? Prior to that, you were a lawyer. Can you talk about the founding of the company and how you got to where you are today? This monstrous company now.
Well, you're right. We started over 30 years ago in the very late 1980s after a brief career practicing law. We put together a small private group, 2 capital partners, 2 working partners, of which I was one.
Yeah.
And we set out to acquire small, well-located retail buildings in Toronto.
Right.
So we focused on Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge and St. Clair, Yonge and Front, and our thinking at the time was that those would prove durable in good times and bad because of the central location. And I think our thinking was sound in that respect. The interesting thing about that is it forced us to learn about office space as well, because these buildings typically had 2 or 3 stories of office above the retail level. And so we needed to learn how to run that space, how to make the most of it. It was very secondary or tertiary office space, but it did have value and it was well located. So we learned how to run that. And probably the most interesting part of that experience were 2 buildings on Front Street that the REIT owns today, which are 3539 Front Street East and 4145 Front Street East. Winners is the user
Nice.
at the retail level, and there's about 100,000 feet of office above. So we bought those in the very late 80s. We overpaid for them, as everybody did for everything in the late 1980s.
Did you remember what the price tag was
I
back
actually
then?
have no idea, but it was way
I feel
more.
like it's higher now.
Way more than, oh yeah, it's gone up since, but it was way more than it was worth. And the very interesting part of that experience is shortly after we bought them, the office market in Toronto collapsed. Demand plummeted, supply shot through the roof because about 3 to 5 million square feet of new supply was brought on stream at the worst possible moment. Vacancy went to 25%.
Right.
The towers could not maintain more than 75% occupancy at that point in time.
Holy.
It was just brutal. They also could not sustain any material level of net rent. They had to go to 0 net or negative net in order to deal with the reality created by oversupply.
Right.
For us, those 2 little brick and beam buildings were very informative because in the context of that collapse, they held up really well. Really well. We always kept them full, and they always generated net rent. And the lesson was, when we thought about it, the reason they were in a way outperforming the towers on a relative basis is they were close to the core, they were really distinctive, and there wasn't a lot of space like it.
Right.
And the realty tax and operating costs were $8.50 a foot compared to $22.50 to $25 a foot.
Nice.
So we could lease out at 20. We got to keep around $12. The towers were leasing out at 20. They were going negative net. So it was a threefold value proposition that was allowing us to outperform, because we didn't know our ass from page 2 at that point in time. Like, we really didn't. We were learning, but we were not seasoned real estate professionals. But we realized that the proximity to the core, the distinctive internal and external attributes, and the lower overall occupancy costs compared to the towers gave us a huge advantage, which sort of carried us comfortably through the early part of the 90s. And one of the parts of this question that I noticed is you asked about the 2 biggest milestones.
Yeah.
And they are easily identifiable. For the first milestone was surviving the collapse
Right.
of the first half of the 1990s.
Right.
It was brutally difficult. I remember going home and telling my wife, we were both pretty young at the time.
Did you have kids at this point?
We had 2 little girls,
Okay.
maybe 6 and 4. And I remember telling her that I was going to be set back for a whole year. And I was so upset. As it turned out, I was set back for 60 months or 5 years. It was a brutal collapse. But we fought our way through it. And by the end of that 5-year period, we hadn't made much money.
Right.
But we had survived. But we really learned how to run real estate in the most adverse circumstances imaginable. So by the mid-90s, we were very credible real estate operators.
Right.
We didn't have much capital, but we had survived. We had met all our obligations. We had helped other people with very troubled projects.
Right.
And we were credible. And we were managing about 5 million square feet of other people's real estate at that point in time.
Oh, okay.
So that management, in a way, brought us information about what was happening. And we could see in the mid-90s things were starting to work.
Right.
The market was starting to reliquidate. Deals were starting to get done. They were painful, but they were getting done.
Right.
And then in 96, they changed the zoning, which was probably the second huge milestone. So the first milestone was a total collapse in the real estate market,
Yeah.
which we were able to survive. The second milestone, and credit for this has to go to Barbara Hall and the planners in the city at the time. What they did in 96 was they looked west of University and east of Yonge, and they saw this huge inventory of older structure that was restricted to light industrial use.
Right.
The problem with all of that is light industry had left ages ago, so
Right,
the
so-
areas were going down.
A lot of vacancies, a lot of...
Oh, and it literally, I guess, dereliction was starting
right.
to come into
Yeah.
those parts of the city. And what Barbara Hall and Paul Bedford, the chief planner of the time, and the council ultimately did is they opened up both areas to any socially acceptable use. So they said you can use those buildings or the land around them for retail purposes if you meet the building code, for office purposes if you meet the building code, for residential purposes.
Right.
And the condo boom we've seen since that point in time is a result of that change.
Okay.
The rapid movement of Allied from the little bit of experience we had on Front Street East into the downtown east and downtown west submarkets was a function of that.
Right.
And we saw the opportunity because of the experience we'd had, and we went for it in 96. We accelerated big time relative to what we were in 98. And by the year 2000, we couldn't create space fast enough to meet the demand. So ironically, for Allied and for me personally in terms of my career, the two biggest milestones occurred fairly early
Yeah.
in our evolution. And the first was a total collapse of the real estate market. And the second was a very imaginative rezoning on the part of the city of Toronto, which changed the face of Toronto
Right.
forever.
Right.
And none of us at the time, not even Allied or the city, realized the transformation that was going to result from that change. But it was
Right.
profound, and it's still going on, and it'll go on for decades.
Right. Equivalent to if the city now was like, okay, the Portlands are opened up and you can have any zoning you want.
Exactly.
Open for business.
Yeah. Because really what they were doing is they were inviting the private sector to determine what the highest and best use of those buildings and that land was.
Yeah.
And the private sector, for the most part, did a really good job.
Yeah.
They really did. And Allied certainly did its part. So that change underpinned the business that we got into. And I suppose the third milestone, if we wanted to add it, would be when we went public in 2003.
Yeah.
That was an Olympian task. It was very hard to take this oddball company
Were there any
public.
Were there any companies like yours at
None.
the time?
That we were utterly unprecedented in the public market.
Right.
And we were almost unprecedented in the private market. And the interesting thing is the public markets understood what we were doing and were prepared to support it. What they didn't know, and what we didn't even know with certainty, was whether we could scale this.
Right.
We knew it was a really good model. We knew it was not just a fad, but really a longer-term trend that we were responding to.
Right.
What we didn't know is if we could really scale this in a public company context, and very obviously we were able to, but we didn't know that at the time, and that was one of the big questions the equity capital markets quite rightly had at the time.
Right. So that leads us right into the next question about Class 1 workspace, which is, I suppose, that light industrial classification. So did you actively then go across Canada and kind of seek out that same type of space? And, you almost have to look for a similar rezoning opportunity, or...
Well, here's what's interesting is the trend that was sort of let loose by the two kings rezoning in 1996 was at work in every city.
Right.
We didn't fully understand that at the time either, but when we went public in 2003, the express purpose of going public was to consolidate office assets east and west of the core that had the three attributes I mentioned.
Right.
Proximity to the core, distinctiveness, and lower occupancy costs.
Right.
The consolidation went incredibly well because it was a much bigger market than people realized, and it was very fragmented. In 2005, more opportunistically than by design, we went into Montreal because we knew Montreal had even more heritage structure than we have here in Toronto. It's different. It's composed differently. It's located in different parts of the downtown. But nonetheless, it's a larger total inventory. We thought of Toronto as about a 14 million square foot inventory. Montreal was about 17 and a half. So we went into Montreal in 2005, and it was very clear.
Right.
The same trend was at work. People were gravitating to buildings that were distinctive, close to the core, and available at lower occupancy costs.
Right.
And we began to accelerate there. We then went to actually Winnipeg, I think. Great market, but not big enough ultimately to propel a business our size.
Okay.
So we sold out of the Winnipeg market. Then we went to Quebec City, then we went to Calgary, then we went to Vancouver.
Right.
So the reason we did all that was not sort of national design, but because we knew these trends were working in every major city. People wanted to be close to the core. They were drawn to these distinctive environments that allowed them to plan for employees who were primarily knowledge workers, like you, like me, and they were available at lower occupancy costs. So this trend was evident across the country in major urban centers.
Is that, by the way, you mentioned the lower property tax, lower occupancy costs. Is that still the case today?
It is. Because we operate in a market value assessment environment, our taxes are a function of the market value of our assets, just as the taxes here at Brookfield Place are a function of much higher market value per square foot.
Right.
So yes, whether it's the same differential that existed when we started, I'm not sure anymore. But there's still a big differential because this will sell for much more per square foot than our typical Class I building.
Right.
Even one that's yielding 30 to 35 net, which many of them are today.
Yeah, yeah. I actually like this question. So, we both, Garrett lives in Liberty, I live in Fort York. We're young gentlemen who love gallivanting across King West. I have many friends who live in buildings that you guys operate, and some of your tenants operate my favorite establishments. So, how do you go about creating a community on, is that by design right at the outset, or is that just you guys had acquired so many buildings? It's really a unique, situation there.
It is a unique situation, and it is a combination of the two things you mentioned. We were fortunate in 1998 to acquire what was then known as the Sable portfolio.
Okay.
And it included a large number of buildings on the south side of King, west of Spadina, and actually on the north side of King, west of Spadina. So in 98, we literally acquired a very significant mass on both sides of King, west of Spadina.
Right.
And we set about to adaptively reuse those beautiful older buildings for office space above grade and retail space at grade. And what we did was, in fact, pre-designed or designed from the outset to create a community. We actually thought about the street in terms of retail. So we weren't just marketing one piece at a time.
Right.
We were trying to figure out who we wanted to attract to the street as a whole, what kind of character we wanted the retail users to have, and we thought about it a lot. And without getting too bogged down in the question, the conclusion we came to essentially was we didn't want national retailers on the street. We wanted strong local enterprises with character, with flair, with a certain element of urban appeal, rather than, if you will, suburban conformity.
Right.
And the best example of that, I probably shouldn't recite it publicly, but I think I have before, so I will again. Tim Hortons came to us and wanted to open up a restaurant in a very valuable piece of space.
Right.
And Tim Hortons is was a great Canadian success story. I think it's now owned by private equity somewhere.
Now we're on Team Second Cup.
Yeah. So we said to them, guys, thank you, but this is not what we want.
Right.
This is not the image we want. You're a great company. We're just little pipsqueaks.
Oh my God.
But this isn't what we want. And they were pissed.
Yeah. Are you talking about your investors or?
No, Tim Hortons. Yeah, no, the investors were cool. They knew what we were doing.
That's a difficult discussion to have, though, and say we are so strongly committed to our.
Yeah, and that's what it took. And that's why I think we were successful in building a community with an identity and with an ethos, if you will. And you know what happened 2 months later? This is a true story. This is where luck comes into it. 2 months later, BMW came along and leased that space for the BMW Mini, which they were just relaunching in the world.
Wow.
And it was the urban car. So it's an international, if you will, retailer. But we were thrilled because that was the image, the urban car.
Right.
That people were marketing in an old warehouse.
Right.
And it did incredibly well until Mini became so successful that they needed a more conventional dealership environment, and they went over to the east side, and now we have Patagonia, which again, while an international brand, represents everything we think is worthy in a business and an environment.
Right.
So it was very much because we had mass right out of the gate, and we added to it aggressively and systematically, but we did also have a vision for the neighborhood, and one that we thought was consistent and authentic and connected well with these beautiful structures that had been built over a century ago.
Yeah.
So, and it did work, and whenever I hear that young guys like you love it there, it makes my day, because that was the whole desire, was to create a neighborhood that would appeal to all kinds of different people, even old guys like me. Although,
uncompromising. No, that's.
Yes, we were focused and we were determined, and I think we sensed well how the world was changing and how it was moving. I don't know how a nerdy lawyer was able to contribute to that.
Oh,
but,
I don't know
but we
if that's
did.
true.
Yeah.
Okay, so I told you this. I wanted the way that we did this. Garrett and I kind of both created a bunch of questions, and I created a bunch of the first ones, and he was a bunch of the second ones.
Perfect.
So it's a little one-sided right now, but so you and I explained this a little bit on the phone. We met for the first time was when I was just starting out in the industry, and my managing director, Dan Holmes at the time, told me, well, when you go to these events, make sure to meet some people that you don't know as well. And so, bright-faced young guy, I was out there meeting every old person that I can, jumping into conversations.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right. That's okay.
Every old person.
Older relative to me. So
Experience.
Experience. Every each one of the what I'm just digging myself.
That's all right,
Sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry. And so I walked up to two the smartest people that I could find at this event, and hey, how's it going? Hey, my name's Dama. What are you guys? Do you guys know anybody here? How are you guys doing? And it was, hey, my name's Michael. Hey, my name's Ed. Whatever. And 2 seconds later, I realized it was you and Ed Sunshine, and you go up to give the presentation on the well. I think we were talking about at the time. So brings us to, and by the way, you were extremely nice and pleasant to me, even as a young guy, who you didn't know. So that was nice. But the well is 3.1 million square foot, mixed use, first of its kind development. Another kind of community building. Development. Exercise. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes that unique?
Yeah. It's interesting that question follows the question about King West or King and Spadina, because what the well is and what it's conceived to be is a big extension of the King Spadina neighborhood. So it is designed, although on a different scale, it has been designed, I think, fairly thoughtfully to be an extension of, or an augmentation of, or a complement to King and Spadina. So to me, that's King and Spadina more vertical. I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you take the stretch of King from Spadina over to Brant, there are 2 mid-block connections between King and Wellington. Right. And people use those mid-block connections to navigate the area because those are the biggest blocks in the city, by far. And so what we did when we acquired the well lands and started the site plan is we just continued those mid-block connections from Wellington to Front. So what we wanted to do was, in a way, make it an extension of what was already there and so appealing.
Right.
We then, in a way, bisected that into 6 pieces and then created the different buildings that we've built there. We put most of the height on the corner, which can carry it both from a planning perspective and aesthetically. Yeah. And then we scaled the development down as we move towards Draper, which is a really special heritage street. And we scaled down as we went towards Wellington, which is also a very sane, quiet, and very pleasant street anchored by parks on each end. Yeah. So we really wanted this to give people the ability to acquire brand new environments, residential, office, and retail in King and Spadina that was consistent with the reality that we had developed over a 20-year time frame. And I think it has worked well. Even the tower on the corner, while new construction, is very distinctive in terms of how it's been designed and in terms of its internal attributes. And it's attracted exactly the kind of tenants that we have at King and Spadina. Yeah. Shopify started at 8082 Spadina in our building. Index Exchange has been somewhere in the downtown west neighborhood for some time, plus elsewhere in the city, and they're consolidating everything into the well office component. Spaces, nice. Is consolidating. Right. Well, actually, they want to have their flagship there. Awesome. And finally, we've done a deal with a top-tier international architecture firm recently. We haven't announced it yet. Not a huge deal, but it gets us from 71 to 76% leased. All the kind of users we serve. So to answer the question, it was designed deliberately to be an extension of the King Spadina neighborhood, not to not to loom over it,
Right.
not to distort it,
Right.
not to compromise it, but hopefully to make it even better, richer. So everything we're doing on the retail component is designed, again, not to serve nationals so much as locals, to have creative, interesting retail use. We're going to try to anchor it with a market.
Right.
Everybody and his brother is doing a market today.
Right.
It's much easier said than done, but we want to do it really well there and then build sort of a neighborhood type aggregation of retail users that, and you know, again, perfect example is Patagonia. It's an international retailer,
Right.
but it represents everything we believe is valuable.
Right.
And we're thrilled, but it's a great, Soma Chocolates is another there on the south side of, you know, it's an unbelievable it's purely local. They
Yeah.
have 2 locations, as you know. But they're great examples of the kind of, Rodney's Oyster Bar.
Yeah.
That's what we want. That's what we want to extend south to Front Street, and I'm sure we'll be successful. So we may have some very large retail users, but they'll be like Patagonia,
Right.
in the sense that they'll be distinctive, they'll be urban,
Right.
they'll be
And synergistic
non-commoditized.
to the
Yeah.
King West
Yeah,
experience
yeah.
as well.
So that's kind of how we've envisaged the well. I'm really pleased with how it's gone. It's coming out of the ground now, as you know.
Fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
very fast.
the deal we've done with Enwave, I think, is great for the complex, but it's also great for Enwave, but it's really, really good for downtown West because it's going to bring that whole deep water cooling system into the downtown West submarket. So I'm really happy with the way that project has evolved, and I think it's evolved in a way that is consistent with, let's call it, the philosophy we've always employed
Right.
in that neighborhood.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we may after this have to talk about, you know, getting Garrett and I a condo deal or something.
I Tridell's there. They're
Yeah.
ready to. They're ready to negotiate. I'm
All right.
sure.
All right. So Allied closed on 2 significant buildings in Montreal just recently. I think over the last couple weeks, and bringing your total square footage to around 5.6 million square feet in Montreal. Can you talk about the Montreal market? And you know, it used to be Toronto, Vancouver, and obviously you guys took a bet there in 2005. But now it's MTV, and every company is recognizing this. You saw it early. How is that market evolving, and where do you see it going?
Yeah. Well, Montreal, as you know, has recovered from difficulty that I think followed in the 70s and 80s on the threat of secession by the then Quebec government. So the city suffered as a result of that to a considerable degree. What we're seeing now, and what we've seen for some time now, is a true renaissance. And it's driven by the fact that Montreal has 6 major institutions of higher learning. 3 French speaking, 3 English speaking. They're educating 150,000 young men and women a year. And now, as the tech, advertising, media, and information sectors pour into Montreal, those young men and women can stay in Montreal and pursue their careers rather than leave Montreal and go to Toronto or Vancouver to pursue their careers there. So what you're seeing is a demand-driven renaissance. But the reason the demand is there is A, because Montreal has become a very stable environment, and B, because there's an incredible talent pool.
Yeah.
And the world's tech, advertising, media, and information organizations are competing globally for talent. So they will never let a material talent pool stay dormant. I mean, Google, for example, is expanding in Montreal. Microsoft is expanding in Montreal. There's a whole artificial intelligence evolution in Montreal, in large part because the University of Montreal has one of the best AI faculties in the world.
Okay.
And some of the leading thinkers. on AI. So it's this education complex that is generating huge amounts of talent that is really underpinning the demand. And so I think Montreal is becoming, probably has already become, but is going to continue to become one of the best cities in the world for knowledge-based organizations.
Right.
Toronto is always going to be Canada's preeminent office market because we have, in addition to the technology talent pool, we really dominate financial services,
Right.
and I think for all practical purposes always will. But Montreal is becoming a great city for knowledge workers, as is Vancouver. And that's what's driving those two markets. And the great thing for Canada is Montreal is not thriving at the expense of Toronto.
Yeah.
Toronto is no longer thriving at the expense of Montreal. It may
Right.
have at one point in time in the 80s and 90s, but it's definitely not thriving at the expense of Montreal, nor at the expense of Vancouver.
Right.
So we're lucky in this country to have 4 or arguably 6 major urban centers that are or are becoming 24-hour cities. For a tiny little country, we have really good and really large cities. More of the Canadian population lives in cities than anywhere else, as you know. It's 70 to 80%. And when Canada became a country, it was the opposite. About 20% lived in the cities and 80%
We were all
lived
rural.
Yeah. So it's changed, and we probably need to change our governance a little bit. But all that aside, Montreal's future is really bright for valid economic reasons.
Yeah.
And the biggest, to my mind, is the fact that they're educating large numbers of men and women every year who have, if you will, capabilities and knowledge that's in demand.
Yeah.
And people will come to them. And, Montreal is a wonderful city to live in. So if you're a computer engineer and you can stay in Montreal and pursue a career with the best in the world, of course you will.
Yeah.
Of course you will.
Mm-hmm. So just an extension of that, because we're talking about the Montreal market, you guys have some assets in Kitchener.
Yeah.
What would be the thesis behind that? Is that something
It's
similar, Waterloo?
Identical.
Yeah.
University.
That's what I'm
We're
thinking.
there for one reason.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. We're there for one reason only: University of Waterloo.
Yeah.
And we're successful there for one reason only. Well, for 2 reasons.
Yeah.
The primary reason is University of Waterloo. The secondary reason is there's actually quite a good little warehouse district
Yeah.
in
Okay.
Kitchener. So the combined impact of that is there's a real market there, and Google is our largest tenant. So Google occupies 186,000 at the Bright Hop block.
Yeah.
Those 2 factors are really why we're in Kitchener. I think it's a long-term position for us, and I almost look at it as an extension of Toronto.
Yeah, I love that, Mark. And by the way, I remember what I said to you and Ed. I walked up and I think you had told me a little bit. Oh, I'm Michael Emory, and I was like, oh my God. And I said, hey, you know what? This space that we're in, it kind of reminds me of Communitech in Kitchener. And you're like, yeah, we own that space.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
It was
No,
by
we're
design.
we're nothing if not consistent.
yeah.
That's good. You guys have a vision and you like to implement it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Switching off a bit of geography, locations, and focuses on that. How do you think co-working as a concept is going to be changing office space in the future?
I don't think it'll change it materially at all. Co-working has been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Co-working, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, it really should be something like flex space, but
Mm-hmm.
forget that for the moment. Co-working meets a very real need on the part of small organizations that could well be in an accelerated growth trajectory for flexible space.
Mm-hmm.
So flexible areas, flexible time frames. We are not, when I say we, Allied, I suspect the other major owner-operators in the cities would say the same thing. We're not geared to serve that segment of the economy. That segment of the economy exists. It may even become larger in relation to the overall business formation.
Right.
So I think co-working serves a real need and has been for some time. Regis has been doing it forever.
Yeah.
We deal with Spaces, who is sort of an affiliate of Regis under common ownership.
We had Wayne Berger on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's changing much. Organizations tend to grow up and or die. And the ones that grow up tend to want long-term space and want long-term configurations, and they want to deal with the people who actually own the real estate rather than someone who's sort of leased it on an intermediate basis. So I don't see it as particularly material to the office sector. I do think a strong co-working sector is symptomatic of a good, healthy office market, but it's a minor part of it. It's an ancillary part of it. I mean, in a city like Toronto, where there's 2% vacancy, they're having great difficulty leasing high caliber space because why would we lease it to WeWork or to Spaces or to anybody else when we can lease it to Shopify or Index Exchange or Google,
Right.
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I'm sure Google once in a while needs temporary space and perhaps gets it from Spaces or WeWork, but Google is not going to change how they establish space long term. They'll even go so far as to buy the asset because there's nothing better than ownership. But where they can't buy it, they want to lease long term. They want stability for and they want to invest a tremendous amount of money in the space so it can serve their employees exactly the way they feel they should be in order to attract, motivate, and retain them. So I don't see any threat to the ownership model represented by co-working. But I do think it can complement a market.
Yeah.
And I'm happy they're prepared to do it, and they are doing it. And the way I look at it, they're incubating tenants for us.
Yeah.
And at some point, tenants simply can't operate within that format. They're going to need something more stable, more structured, longer term. So I think it's a terrific, it's not a new development, but I think it's a terrific part of a healthy office market. Then if you go to compromised or troubled markets, that's where it's easier for co-working enterprises to get space. So they probably have no trouble getting it in Calgary, but they have terrible trouble getting it in Toronto.
Right.
They were successful in Montreal, especially in the downtown core, 4 or 5 years ago when the core was weak. Now that the core is strengthening in response to the changes that are going on in Montreal, it becomes tougher.
Right.
So very helpful evolution.
Right.
One that, frankly, I think serves us long term in the sense that users that we can't currently accommodate are getting good accommodation.
Yeah.
And when the time comes, there's a very good chance they'll come to us.
Yeah.
Which is why we'll lease space to Spaces, because their deal structure is sensible from our perspective as an owner, number one. And number two, those different enterprises become, if you will, acclimatized to the Allied environment.
Yeah.
Hopefully one day, if they want permanent space, they'll at least consider us.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I look at it. But it's a very natural evolution in a market where a lot of startup enterprises exist. And startup enterprises are good for the economy, for my business, for your business. And accommodating their very unique needs is a good business in and of itself. So it's a good business.
Yeah.
How big a business it becomes, this notion that it's going to be 30% of the office space in the world, not a chance.
Okay.
That's ludicrous. I mean, that's plain laughable.
Okay.
Right now we look at our portfolio, we have less than 1%, and we've been dealing with these guys for about a decade now.
Right.
But
we shouldn't expect to see Allied announce their own co-working.
never. No,
That was Oxford, right?
Oxford did that, yeah.
They did it, but only, it's kind of interesting. Oxford's a really good organization, and they did it only in Calgary. And the only reason they did it in Calgary is because the market sucks.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think they've even been at pains since then to make it clear, listen, this is not a business we're going into.
Right.
We did it there in response to adverse circumstances. We're not doing it in Toronto. We're not doing it
not
in
happening
New
in this
York.
building.
It ain't happening at Brookfield Place. So I think it's kind of interesting that the only time Allied ever even thought about doing it was, again, in a building we have in Calgary. We've got the Lougheed building, which we're redeveloping now. It's a beautiful heritage building. And, for about 25 minutes, I thought maybe we should create the Allied Flex Space
Right.
environment in that beautiful heritage building, which
Yeah.
is so well suited for it.
Because it would be awesome.
Yeah, but then I thought, no, that just doesn't do justice to the building.
Right.
And I wouldn't even put an established co-working enterprise in there. Again, it wouldn't do justice to the building. The building is outstanding.
Yeah.
It may take us 3 or 4 years to lease it. I don't care. I do care, but I'll wait to the extent necessary to
Right.
get the caliber of user I want.
Right.
I think what happens is, markets that are really compromised are more fertile ground for co-working enterprises wanting to expand than sort of super strong markets like Toronto. Like Toronto is, 2% vacancy is unthinkable. In King and Spadina, we have 99.9% occupancy.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah,
that
that's
is
pretty huge.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
And it's true, but it's crazy. I mean, in Toronto as a whole, I think we're 98.2.
Wow.
It's not that we're geniuses. It's just the demand exceeds the supply materially.
Right.
And the supply will catch up to the demand, but it's going to take another 3 years at least for that to happen.
Yeah.
Because there's not a lot of space left to effectively build new office towers. Like you have some like right there, but
Yeah.
it doesn't.
That's why downtown west and downtown east is where the action is.
Yeah, that's a solid core. You talked about this a bit before because it's one of your 3 core values.
Sure.
So 400 West Georgia in Vancouver, obviously a very distinctive design, as it's effectively looks like a significant number of boxes shooting out of the side of the building with trees surrounding it, effectively. With innovations in technology and obviously a limited supply of heritage space that you can actually purchase for that distinctiveness, is this allowing you to effectively develop new, innovative, distinctive space?
Yes. I mean, the answer is unequivocally and categorically yes. And when we looked at 400 West Georgia with West Bank, it was exactly that distinctiveness that persuaded us and our board that it was entirely appropriate for Allied, even though it's new construction. So we're quite prepared to participate in new construction like the Well, like 400 West Georgia, but it has to be distinctive in a meaningful way, not in a superficial way. So certainly it has to be distinctive design, and it has to have the distinctive attributes that motivate knowledge-based organizations. So in our experience, that means very high ceilings, very large floor plates, a floor plate that lends itself extremely well to an open plan, a tremendous amount of natural light, and we believe, now not everyone would agree with us, although I think more and more are as time passes, we believe the raised floor in new construction is essential to meet the needs of the knowledge-based organizations for good air and dense utilization. The old way of distributing air from ducts in a ceiling is nowhere near as efficient or as good for human beings as air that's distributed from a pressurized underfloor. For two reasons. One, the air that comes from the underfloor actually moves past us, whereas the air that comes from the ceiling sometimes never gets to us, interestingly, physically. The second thing is the environment we're in here is actually pressurized, the one we're sitting in now. So if there was an operable window there and we opened it, all the paper in the room would fly out the window.
Right.
When you have a raised floor, the subfloor is where the pressurization occurs, and then the portion of the floor that people live in and occupy is not pressurized, which is better for them in terms of human wellness. But it also means you can have operable windows even in a tower, and you can open them, and neither people nor paper will fly out because of the pressure. So you simply cannot have, to the best of my knowledge, an operable window unless you have a raised floor which is pressurized. And anything we've built new, including the well, including 400 West Georgia, actually has a raised floor and operable windows. Because operable windows are also obviously good for air. Not 360 days of the year. Obviously, the summer, it ain't good. But, in the spring and the fall, and maybe early and late winter, it's a wonderful way to bring fresh air into the environment. So we think new construction, if it has the attributes that we know people want for the purposes of sustainability, for the purposes of wellness, for the purposes of open planning, then absolutely we'll do it.
Ticks
But
all
it
the
does have to
boxes.
be distinctive, as you say. It can't be just another box.
Yeah. A rectangle.
Now, and again, distinctiveness can be a trap too. One of the things we thought about hard on 400 West Georgia is how inefficient is the floor plate. And it's obviously less efficient than a perfect rectangle, but actually because of the design and because the designers thought about it, it's nowhere near as inefficient as it looks as though it would be. And it's kind of it. So, Deloitte is the lead tenant there. They were, as accountants, they were very sensitive to the efficiency.
Right.
And very alert to it. And then Spaces, and most recently Northeastern University. So it's a wonderful example of how the distinctiveness of the structure actually attracted the very kind of users we want to serve.
Yeah. Thought leaders.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's neat.
You
I
are
would love to go into that building. It honestly looks fantastic.
We'll tour it. We'll arrange for you guys to tour it for sure.
I love it.
By the way, is that the reason that, because of the pressurized system, why most offices just don't have windows?
Yes.
Okay. Is it the same reason for hotels?
Yes. Well, hotels may have other reasons too. They may not want their customers able to get out the windows. I don't know. I don't know enough about the hotel business, but right. I suspect the main reason high-rise structures have fixed windows is because it creates a more efficient HVAC environment.
Yeah.
Because it's closed.
Yeah.
Versus having people just open
it's
their windows.
It's pressurized and it keeps the air in. It allows you to balance the air better, etc. Right. When the floor is pressurized, we don't throw our system out of balance we could have every window in the building open or every window closed. It won't throw the system out of balance.
Cool. Very cool.
Gotcha. I didn't actually know that.
No, I didn't.
That's actually really neat.
Yeah. No, there have been some wonderful innovations in building technology in the last decade and a half.
Yeah,
really,
I would never have thought that just because of the pressurization from the ceiling, obviously, pushing stuff down, it doesn't have anywhere to go. Yeah. For the air that's here.
Especially hot air.
Yeah, especially hot air.
Stays
Hot air
up there.
wants to stay up there. So, obviously, you invest in a lot of heritage buildings. A lot of people have this problem in the residential market. Everybody's worried about foreign capital, people trying to park their money into condos, stuff like that. single-family homes in the suburban market. Do you see any foreign capital players coming in, trying to buy up these heritage assets for, trophies or anything like that, and overpaying? Is there any disruption at all?
Not really, but I think what we're seeing in the major urban centers is what's sometimes referred to as a wall of capital. So money is, sorry guys, money is almost the cheapest commodity in our business today. If you just have money, you have nothing. You need know-how, you need market position, you need access, you need credibility as a buyer. So there has been more money seeking property than there is property for years now.
Mm-hmm.
But the local operators are always, the well-funded local operators are always at an advantage because they just know the market better. But there's huge demand for our cities commercially and residentially. And that's actually a good thing from my perspective, because what it means is that capital is sometimes, rather than coming into buying a little brick and beam building, it comes into Allied.
Mm-hmm.
So our investor base has become
Right.
global. We spend time in Asia meeting with investors. We spend time in Europe. We spend a lot of time in the United States. And it's because people want to invest in our cities, and Allied isn't the only way, but it's a very good way to invest in Canadian cities.
Mm-hmm.
It's by no means the only way, but it's a very good way to do it through a public entity. And so in a way, the interest on the part of foreign investors helps us more than hinders us.
Right.
It's very rare that we'll lose a bidding process if something is strategic for Allied. Our cost of capital is so good. What we can do with the asset is so well developed that if we lose a bidding war, it's because it wasn't strategic enough for us to pay whatever had to be paid. But if it's strategic, we generally will get it, and often off market. But so it's a great question. There's tremendous international interest in our cities, tremendous. And as I say, one of the interesting things is it isn't necessarily coming in as a direct investment competition, but it may be coming into Allied as institutional investment from overseas. It may be coming into some of the private equity players,
Right.
who then go into the market and do what they do, which is a little different from what Allied does, but both economically successful activities.
Okay.
So it's probably more of a plus than a negative,
Okay.
in my opinion.
Yeah, because they're at least investing in, Canadian-based operators
Correct.
at this point versus
Because
direct.
the operators have an advantage.
Yeah, because they
you
have
know,
the experience.
You're sitting in Korea. I mean, unless you have operating
Right.
capability, it's really
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah.
Not
So
much
you're
you can
much
do.
more likely to do a deal with Oxford.
Yeah.
And
Right. Who are big?
yeah, well,
Canadian
yeah,
companies are big
exactly,
and successful
yeah.
companies as well.
Yeah.
No, our real estate industry has become one of the better organized and more successful industries around.
Right.
And it's very stable. The players are accountable. They're using huge amounts of equity. So, even a Blackstone, for example, which is
Yeah.
probably the greatest private equity firm of all time, and likely to continue in that capacity, they don't just come in on their own. They
No.
always have relationships. I mean, they bought the Bentall properties in Vancouver,
Right.
but they did it with Hudson Pacific, which is a very successful U.S. REIT that specializes on the west coast of the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
Same
So they
thing
brought-
same thing in the apartment world. They
Yeah.
bought 14
Starlight,
properties
yeah.
with Starlight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even private, I mean, not even, but even enterprises as aggressive and entrepreneurial as the major private equity players need operating expertise. They don't have it. They don't want to develop it internally, but they absolutely need it to do what they do.
Right. And yeah, not easy to compete when,
Yeah.
like, I like the idea of, whatever, the foreign investors trying to compete, and then they hear, oh, the competing bid, they came in firm. It's like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
How?
No. Yeah, no, exactly. You just, you can't beat the local guys.
Yeah.
Especially if there's a good, strong local industry, so which we clearly have in Canada.
Right.
We're pretty tapped out for time, so I feel like you should jump into your last
Okay,
question, your
sure.
favorite one.
The final question. Oh,
It's not this one. It's a secret question.
Okay, sure.
okay, wait. Can
I
I
better not sit
can I give
down.
you like a 20-second question?
Sure.
And I'm gonna butcher this question too because I don't understand it fully. The internet connected, something you have on your website is you had to upgrade. You had to change Allied from like there's an internet system there. Something.
Well, we own one of 8 internet hubs in North America, and the only internet hub in Canada. It's 151 Front Street West, and it's where all of the carriers interconnect with one another to create a telecommunications hub, and then all the internet service providers and related organizations connect in, and what they effectively create is this dense interconnection hub. So it's a whole aspect of our business. It would take me too long to
Okay.
not that it's terribly complex, but it would take me a long while to explain what it means and how it relates to our business. There's a pretty good section in the MD&A on it, but I think it would just take up too much time here to be worthwhile.
Maybe that's for the podcast 2020.
Maybe another podcast, because you could do a
2020.
whole podcast on that. It's very interesting because it's part of how the world is interconnecting, and we're almost, by good luck, more than design, we're right in the middle of it. So anyway, it's kind of cool.
Cool. Okay, this is the final question.
Sure.
It's called The Three Truths, so not on the sheet.
Okay.
Imagine years from now, you live to be 150 years old, and you have this incredible life, and your kids and the grandkids and great-grandkids are doing, and they're all women, obviously, because it's your family.
Absolutely.
That's
my fate.
Everybody's doing exceptionally well, and everybody's happy, but for whatever reason, it's your last day, and everybody's around you, and you have 3 short notes of kind of life that you can pass along. Oh, I butchered it a little bit.
Okay.
Everything that you've ever
truths.
written or putting out has been erased. So this is all that they have to carry on from you. And you can write down 3 short notes. What would you put on those notes?
Well, that is a challenging question. What first comes to my mind is be humanistic in your outlook. Be deeply, profoundly, and unequivocally humanistic in how you see the world, how you deal with other people. Number 2, think hard, think deep, think forever. You can think your way forward in this life. You can imagine possibilities that other people may have difficulty imagining. So never stop thinking, and probably never stop learning, which would be just a corollary of that. And then finally, and this is a bit of a cliche, but it's something I've experienced, find something you love to do. Doesn't matter what it is. Weaving baskets, or building buildings, designing software, or painting pictures. Find something you love. Everything else will fall in place. So those would be the 3 things.
Wow.
Profound.
Yeah. I almost feel like we sent them to you, which we did.
I know. I know.
Wow. Thank you so much for
You're
joining us.
very
It was
welcome.
a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Lots of fun.